Over the past couple lectures, we've been talking about social organization, starting at the level of individuals with gender and working our way to marriage. This week, we're going to talk about larger organizational categories that are usually considered to be related to kinship. The role that descent actually plays in these categories is very small, though. We'll see that biology is really used as a way of rationalizing cultural differences, rather than being the basis for the differences in the first place. Before I dive into the guts of race and ethnicity, however, we should talk about exactly what is meant by ascribed and achieved status. Thus far in this course, we've talked about a variety of social statuses or positions within society: man, woman, husband, wife, uncle, cousin, etc. For the most part, these statuses have been what anthropologists call ascribed, meaning they're assigned to an individual whether that individual does anything or not. In most cultures, it's not up to the person to choose his or her gender status, or to choose whether or not to become an uncle. There's either no choice at all, or the decisions are made by others based on age, gender, or biological relationships. On the other hand, there are some statuses we've talked about, specifically husband, wife, father, mother, that are achieved, meaning the individual must do something in order to acquire that status. Other achieved statuses might be excellent hunter or mayor. All societies have both ascribed and achieved statuses. Cultures differ, however, in which particular statuses are ascribed and which are achieved, and what principles underlie the ascription. For example, many hunting and gathering groups ascribe only age and gender roles. All members of the same age group and gender hold roughly the same statuses. Differences between them are all achieved. In other cultures, statuses other than age and gender can be ascribed. A person can hold a leadership position based on who his parents are. Those same positions might also be achieved through a person's hard work and training, or they might be totally closed to achievement. What anthropologists have learned is that some statuses that we tell ourselves are always ascribed are, in fact, often achieved. Ethnicity is one of these. Ethnicity is the part of a person's identity that he or she acquires as a result of being raised in a particular cultural environment. An ethnic group is one whose members share cultural beliefs, ideas, etc., and more importantly, they self-identify as a group. Membership in an ethnic group can be based on shared geographic origin, religion, language, history, or any other cultural experience. Your textbook defines an ethnic group as one among several, and the concept of an ethnic group only really makes sense in contrast to other such groups. That is, it's hard to talk about ethnicity if there's only one group. One's ethnicity is often variable and contextual. It's often ascribed at birth based on the ethnicity of one's parents. However, as one moves among various social contexts and different social institutions and statuses become relevant, one's ethnic status shifts. Thus, ethnicity is largely an achieved status in most social contexts. The shifts of which ethnic groups are relevant often comes from contrast with one another. A person born to an Irish father and American mother may choose to identify himself as Irish while in America and as American while in Ireland, or vice versa, depending on whether he wants to stand out or fit in. What's important with ethnic identity is not the person's parentage or even their upbringing, but the immediate social context and which other ethnic groups are present. Unfortunately, and probably because of this fluidity, the English language has been very imprecise in how it refers to these sorts of differences among groups. Ethnicity is a fairly recent term. In past eras, labels used for roughly the same concept included tribe, race, nation, nationality, and many others. We'll explore contemporary definitions of race in a moment and tribe in the next lecture. But nationality and nation are still often used almost interchangeably with ethnic group. In the more careful, scholarly use of the term nationality, It means an ethnic group that either does, did, or hopes to have its own nation-state. A nation-state is a form of government that aspires to be ethnically homogeneous so that everyone shares the same cultural and linguistic background. According to the Western European ideology of politics, which is increasingly global, every state should aspire to be a nation-state. On the other hand, as we just discussed, ethnic groups don't make much sense in isolation from one another, and states, by definition, have a hierarchy. Within any state, some people and groups have greater and more secure access to wealth, power, and prestige. Often in multi-ethnic states, this hierarchy is formed around ethnic differences. One ethnic group will dominate the society, controlling resources and making decisions that affect everyone else. This ethnic group is known as the social majority, not because there's necessarily more of them numerically, but because they control the majority of resources. Other groups are social minorities, controlling less of the society's resources. And of course, where there are 3 or more such ethnic groups, some minorities may be more highly ranked than others. It's the stratification of ethnicity in many cultures around the world that has led to the persistence of race as a relevant social concept long after its supposed biological roots were disproven. The popular concept of race that one is likely to encounter outside of academia holds that race is a kind of biological group, where membership in the group is fixed at birth, based on the racial identities of one's parents, and cannot change. Essentially, races are different kinds of human being. Such categories are supposed to be discrete, clear, and non-overlapping. Everyone belongs to one and only one race. This popular non-scientific definition of race used to be the scientific definition too. The idea of race comes into anthropology through physical anthropology, the subdiscipline attempting to understand humans as a biological species. Early physical anthropologists saw that there was variation within the species, and they sought to describe it scientifically. Anthropological racism, as a scientific theory, was the idea that the human species could be divided into distinct subspecies or varieties. A race, then, is a subspecies of the human species Homo sapiens, and one of the tasks of physical anthropology is to describe which subspecies exist. Racial classification, the sorting of people into racial categories, was the goal of anthropological racism. Physical anthropologists sought to determine exactly which biological traits varied among all the various subspecies, so they could definitively assign any given person one and only one race. The thing is, after centuries of physical anthropology research into human biological variation, what physical anthropologists have discovered is that there are no recognizable subspecies of Homo sapiens in the world today. We all belong to the same subspecies, Homo sapiens sapiens. So the task of sorting living people into different racial groups is pointless, since we'd all end up in the same box. So today, the theory of anthropological racism has been thoroughly discredited, but physical anthropologists didn't give up on the idea easily. For more than 200 years, scientists tried to find a scientifically valid way of dividing the species up into smaller categories based on biological differences. They encountered ever-increasing problems as they learned more about us. Your textbook has an excellent discussion of why such racial classification isn't useful and how we currently understand biological variation. I won't cover that material here today, but you will be responsible for it on the exam. If scientists no longer consider anthropological racism to be a valid explanation of human biology, how do scientists today define race? Well, race, as many modern social scientists use the term, is a kind of ethnic group that is purely cultural and not biological at all. However, members of the group and others believe incorrectly that membership is biologically determined and unchanging. Remember that ethnic groups are defined by their shared cultural ideas as well as their self-identification as a group. In the case of race, the ideas that everyone shares are incorrect ideas about how human biology works. Based on those incorrect ideas, people sort themselves into self-identifying racial categories. But those categories in reality make no sense in terms of biology. This does not, however, mean that race is not an important social category. People think it's real, so they make it real. One reason that it took 200 years for physical anthropologists to accept that races aren't real biological categories is that they are real social categories. Which race one belongs to has real consequences for almost every aspect of one's daily life. Race, especially in the United States, became embedded in our social hierarchy. Hierarchies in general are ways of organizing relationships by letting people interact with one another on the basis of their relative ranks, rather than based on individual traits. You might not know someone personally, but you can determine where he sits in the social hierarchy and adjust your behavior appropriately. This means that any hierarchy operates, at least in part, according to stereotypes, fixed ideas about what members of a group are like. Usually, stereotypes are unfavorable, but not always. It's a stereotype that Asians are smarter than other groups, but that's hardly an insult. When two individuals, otherwise unknown to one another, meet, they interact according to their stereotyped beliefs about the other's status. A stereotype is a kind of bias, a tendency to draw a particular conclusion in the absence of or in opposition to evidence. When the bias is negative, a tendency to draw an unfavorable conclusion, it becomes prejudice. Prejudice typically describes the attitudes of higher-ranking groups toward lower-ranking groups. But prejudice is not necessarily discrimination, which refers to actions, not attitudes. Discrimination is an action taken based on prejudice that harms a member of another group. It can be de jure, legally codified, such as Jim Crow laws in the segregated South, or de facto, informal but still real, such as the discrepancies between sentences given to white and black defendants convicted of the same crimes. Since racial systems are often hierarchical, and a person's position in the hierarchy can greatly help or harm him, one's race becomes very important to daily interaction. Given the very real social, economic, and political consequences of being ascribed one race or another, race scientists had great incentive to demonstrate that such racial categories were more than just culture. If these racial categories reflected real biological differences, then the stereotypes could be verified, prejudices approved, and discrimination justified. So for 2 centuries, the race scientists tried to identify the fundamental biological differences that underlay race. Except, of course, that race isn't a simple, discrete biological reality. Anthropological racism thought of races as nice, non-overlapping categories. Everyone belonged to exactly one and only one race, and that racial identity should be obvious. The reality of human biology is messy, overlapping, with a lot of fuzzy boundaries and individuals who don't quite fit into any category. Biracial or interracial people are, in some communities, more common than those who clearly belong to one race or another. What do you do with those people? Where do they fall in the hierarchy? Which stereotype applies to someone with one Hispanic and one Asian parent? Do you treat them legally as Hispanic or Asian? In other parts of the world, biracial people were incorporated into the social hierarchy on their own level. In the colonial Caribbean, for example, those of mixed European and African ancestry were called mulatto, and sat between white and black social classes. In the US, a different pattern evolved. US culture practiced a system called hypodescent. Biracial individuals are ascribed the racial identity of their lower-ranking parent. Some states, especially in the South, codified hypodescent with so-called one-drop rules, which stated that any known black ancestry at all was enough to legally identify a person, and by extension all of his or her descendants forever, as black. The net effect of such laws was to make biracialism extremely rare. They attempted to avoid the scientific problems of biracialism by just making it illegal to be biracial. On the other hand, race and racial prejudice are not limited to the largely Western scientific tradition of anthropological racism. As your textbook describes in some detail, Japanese culture still has its own racial hierarchy, despite being one of the most culturally and genetically uniform nation-states on Earth. The Burakumin, a supposed racial group within Japanese society, evolved originally due to economic factors in the Japanese medieval period. But since they were socially isolated and seldom intermarried with the larger Japanese society, after many generations they were considered a biological racial group. Much of the discrimination against Burakumin in Japanese society has been very reminiscent of discrimination against African Americans. When there are no obvious physical differences on which to base their racial hierarchy, people will just invent them. The other side of this issue of racial hierarchy is Brazil. Brazilians, like pretty much the whole rest of the world, have traditionally accepted the idea of biologically real races. But recall, of course, that races are actually cultural categories describing social differences. Like all ethnic groups, racial identity is culturally defined and changeable. Brazilian culture has evolved a system of racial categories so complex and so fluid that a consistent hierarchy is largely impossible. The terms a person uses to describe others' racial identity, or even his own, change constantly. Brazilians recognize race labels like white and black and Asian, but those categories aren't the same as in the US. An American can step onto a plane in New York as a black man, and step off the plane in Rio de Janeiro as a white man. So, even though we traditionally tell ourselves otherwise, race is just another kind of ethnicity, and ethnicity is really just another name for culture. We use that special name when we're talking about the relationships between different cultural groups and how they interact with one another. Most modern nation-states, even if they aspire to be ethnically homogeneous, are multi-ethnic. Racial hierarchies are an example of these inter-ethnic relationships, but similar processes play out in any multi-ethnic setting. The idea of the homogeneous nation-state emerged in the 19th century period of imperialism, when the ideal goal for inter-ethnic relationships was ultimately assimilationist. In a process of assimilation, a social minority ethnic group is absorbed into a larger social majority. Over time, the things that made the minority self-identify as an ethnic group are lost, and members or their descendants come to identify only as part of the majority ethnic group. The old saying that America is a melting pot comes from this philosophy. While immigrants arrive in America identifying with a range of ethnic identities, they will eventually melt down and merge with mainstream American society to become Americans. Not all interactions have been assimilationist because not all states have been founded on the model of the nation-state. In traditional Persia, modern Iran, a plural society evolved. In a plural society, different ethnic groups coexist more or less permanently, but they continue to interact peacefully because of ecological or economic specialization. One ethnic group is agricultural and another is pastoral, for example. While they continue to interact regularly as part of the same society, they maintain their cultural and ethnic distinctiveness. More recently, especially in the West, the concept of a nation-state has broadened to embrace the potential for multiculturalism. Under this philosophy, ethnic diversity is seen as strengthening the nation-state. Assimilation, the elimination of diversity, weakens the nation-state. Under this ideal, America is not a melting pot where everyone is ultimately reduced to uniformity, but rather America is a salad bowl. Just as one can untoss a salad by sorting out the lettuce from the tomatoes from the cucumbers, so do all the various ethnic groups remain distinct in American society. But this isn't quite pluralism on the Persian model because the different ethnic groups aren't economically or ecologically specialized. They all do largely the same things, just as all the parts of a salad are covered with the same salad dressing. Multiculturalism is currently the guiding philosophy for interethnic relations in the US and, to a lesser degree, in many other Western nations. Many non-Western nations still aspire to the older, more homogeneous model of the nation-state. In places like Africa, they're quite far from that ideal, but they still pursue it. In, for example, Korea or Japan, the ideal has largely been realized. For those nation-states pursuing ethnic homogeneity, how do they go about it? Of course, there are as many specific strategies as there are nations. Some strategies are more persuasive, and others are more coercive. Unfortunately, the more coercive strategies seem to be more common historically. The most extreme method for attaining ethnic homogeneity is genocide, the murder of anyone who belongs to a particular ethnic group. Less extreme strategies are ethnocide, exterminating the cultural practices but not the people themselves. For example, for decades, the American government forced Native American children to attend boarding schools where they were forbidden from following their traditional cultures. Those children eventually returned to their homes with very different cultural identities. Ethnic cleansing or expulsion is another example, where members of ethnic minorities are simply expelled from a nation-state. The goal is to create a homogeneous nation. What happens to minorities in other nations isn't important. The good news in all this is that things do seem to be getting better. Thanks to the work of social scientists in the last several decades, more people than ever recognize that race is not a biological reality. That, coupled with the spread of multiculturalism, means that interethnic relations in the 21st century are more likely than ever to be peaceful and beneficial for all involved. It's often easy to get so bogged down in the negatives that we forget to appreciate the positives in our lives. And the changes that have come to our understanding of race and ethnicity in recent years are certainly positive. And that seems like a good place to end the lecture.